The Bible. The Bible is a collection of texts that were written over a period of many centuries by a variety of authors. The word Bible comes from the Greek biblios, which means little books. It is divided into the two main parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament contains texts that were written before the birth of Jesus Christ and includes the Torah, which is the foundation of Jewish scripture. The New Testament contains texts that were written after the birth of Jesus and includes the Gospels, which tell the story of Jesus' life and teachings. The Old Testament contains 39 books. The books are divided into four main sections: the Pentateuch, the five first books, also known as the Torah, the historical books, the wisdom literature, and the prophetic books. The New Testament contains 27 books, which are divided into four main sections: the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the Epistles, and the Book of Revelation. The texts that make up the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Bible, were primarily written by ancient Israelites and were later collected and translated into Greek during the time of the Greek Empire. The texts that make up the New Testament were written by early followers of Jesus Christ and were originally written in Greek. The texts of both an Old and New Testament were later translated into many languages. 39 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and Samuel. Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, and Proverbs. Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And the 27 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. What is literature? Literature refers to written or spoken works that are considered to have artistic or intellectual value. Literature can take many forms, including poetry, novels, plays, short stories, and essays. Literature can be categorized into different genres, such as fiction, non-fiction, drama, and poetry. Fiction literature is a genre that includes made-up stories and characters. Non-fiction literature refers to literature that is based on real events, people, and places. Drama is a genre that includes plays, scripts, and screenplays. Poetry is a genre of literature that uses metrical and rhythmic language to evoke emotions, paint vivid imagery, or convey complex ideas. What is literature? Literature can also be grouped by historical period like the medieval, Renaissance, modern, and post-modern literature. In general, literature is an expression of human experience and imagination. It can be used to entertain, educate, and inspire. It can also reflect the culture and values of the society in which it was created. Literary criticism. Literary criticism is the analysis and interpretation of literary works using various approaches. Compose an independent critique of a chosen selection based on the following approaches: moralism, structuralism, formalism, Marxism, feminism, historicism, and reader response. Moralism. Moralism is an approach that judges the value of a literary work based on its moral ethical influence on its readers. Thus, the text influenced the reader toward good and noble behavior. How? Does the text promote wrong behavior? How? What lesson does the author present or teach in the text? In the Bible, there is three books that are focusing on the moralism. That, that's Leviticus, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. The books of Ecclesiastes. This book reflects on the meaning and purpose of life from a moral perspective, emphasizing the importance of living a virtuous life. The Book of Proverbs. This book contains a collection of sayings and wisdom literature that emphasizes the importance of moral virtues such as wisdom, righteousness, and justice. The Book of Leviticus. This book contains laws and regulations that govern the Israelites' moral and religious behavior, such as the Ten Commandments. Moralism. The Book of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 3. A time for everything. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. He has made everything beautiful in His time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear Him. All go to the same place, all come from dust, and to dust all return. So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? Moralism, Book of Ecclesiastes. About the book and the author. The Book of Ecclesiastes is a book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament attributed to the teacher, also known as Kohelet, which means preacher or teacher in Hebrew. The author is traditionally considered to be King Solomon. King Solomon, also known as Jedediah, was the son of King David and Bathsheba, and the third king of Israel. He ruled Israel for 40 years. God appeared to Solomon in a dream and offered him the opportunity to ask for anything he wanted. Solomon asked for wisdom and knowledge to rule his people justly. God was pleased with his request and granted him not only wisdom but also riches and honor. What lesson does the author present or teach in the text? This chapter of Ecclesiastes reflects on the cynical nature of life and the transitory nature of human existence. This passage relates to moralism in several ways. Firstly, it highlights the idea of balance and the importance of living in accordance with the natural rhythms of life. It suggests that there is a proper time for everything and that we should strive to live in harmony with these natural rhythms rather than going against them. This can be seen as a call to live a virtuous life by following the natural order of things and practicing self-control. Secondly, it also emphasizes the idea that there is a purpose for everything, which relates to the moral principle of having a sense of purpose and living a meaningful life. The verse suggests that everything has a purpose and that we should strive to understand and fulfill that purpose. This can be seen as a call to live a virtuous life by understanding the purpose of things and seeking to fulfill it. Lastly, it also reflects on the idea of the transience of life, that everything is temporary and fleeting, and that ultimately everything will come to an end. This can be seen as a reminder to live a virtuous life by making the most of the time we have and living with integrity, avoiding wasting time in futile pursuits. Here are the more books that we can find and apply the literary approaches in moralism. Proverbs and Leviticus. Marxism. Marxism is an approach that focuses on how the economy system and social class oppresses the poor and promotes the interests of the dominant rich. What social classes do, the characters represent. What is the struggle among the social classes in the text? What tools do the upper class use to keep themselves in power? Government, religion, or literature? Do the characters from the lower class realize their lack of power, or are they actively fighting against injustice? Many of the prophetic books in the Bible, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos, address issues of social justice and the rights of the poor, and criticize the wealthy and powerful for their oppression and exploitation of the poor. The Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which tell the story of Jesus, also address themes of social and economic justice, and Jesus himself is portrayed as a champion of the poor and oppressed. The Book of James, the Epistle of James, addresses social and economic justice, particularly the rich exploiting the poor. The Book of Revelation. It's a complex book with different interpretation, but in some views it can be read as a critique of the Roman Empire and its oppressive economic and political system. So we'll be using the Book of James as an example of Marxism literary. About the book and the author. The Book of James in the New Testament of the Bible is traditionally attributed to James, the brother of Jesus. According to early Christian tradition, James was a leader of the Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem and was considered by some to be the bishop of Jerusalem. In the letter, James addresses various issues facing the Jewish Christian community, including issues of faith and works, wisdom, poverty, and wealth, and the proper use of the tongue. James 2, chapter 2, verse 1 to 30. My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, must not know favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, "Here's a good seat for you," but say to the poor man, "You stand there or sit on the floor by my feet," have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my dear brother and sisters. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom He promised those who love Him? But you have dishonored the poor. It is not the rich who are exploiting you. Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of Him to whom you belong? If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For He who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not murder." If you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. Because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Marxism is an approach that focuses on how the economy systems and social class oppresses the poor and promotes the interests of the dominant rich. So among those questions, we will be answering the question, what is the struggle among the social classes in the text? In James 2, Chapter 2, verse 1 to 13 can be related to Marxism in the sense that it emphasizes the importance of treating all people with equality and fairness, regardless of their social class or wealth. This aligns with the Marxist idea of social justice, which calls for the fair distribution of resources and the elimination of class distinctions. In this passage, James speaks against showing partiality to the rich and powerful and instead calls for treating all people with equality and fairness. He emphasizes that faith without works is dead and that true faith is demonstrated through good works and actions. He also says that if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. This passage can be interpreted as a critique of capitalist greed and a call for the fair treatment of all people, regardless of their wealth or social status. Feminism. Feminism is an approach that increases a reader's sensitivities on how the nature roles and treatment of women are portrayed in a literary piece. How do the male characters talk about the female characters? How do the male characters treat the female characters? How do the female characters conforming to traditional views on women? Or do you find the female characters challenging these traditional views? Based on the text, what are the expected roles and behaviors on women? What are the effects on these expectations? We will mostly find the story of feminism in the book of Ruth, Esther, Proverbs, and Isaiah. Feminism. The Book of Ruth. This book tells the story of a strong and independent woman who defies societal expectations and chooses to follow her own path. Ruth's actions and characters are often seen as an example of feminist ideals, such as the importance of female agency and autonomy. The Book of Esther. This book tells the story of a Jewish woman who becomes queen of Persia and uses her position to save her people from persecution. Esther's story highlights the importance of women in leadership positions and the power of women to make a difference in the world. The Book of Proverbs. This book contains several passages that promote the idea of strong, capable woman. Proverbs 31 in particular is often cited as an example of biblical feminism, as it describes a woman who is intelligent, hardworking, and respected by her community. The Book of Isaiah. This book contains passages that speak about God creating both men and women in His image, and that speak about God's desire for both women and men to be able to participate in the life of the community. The Book of Esther. About the book and the author. The Book of Esther is the Old Testament of the Bible, is traditionally attributed to an anonymous author. The author of the Book of Esther is not mentioned in the text itself, and there is no definitive information about who wrote it or when it was written. Some scholars believe that the book was written in the Persian period, in the 5th century BCE, while others argue that it was written later, during the Hellenistic period. The Book of Esther is a historical narrative that tells the story of the rescue of the Jewish people from persecution of the Persian Empire by Queen Esther, a Jewish woman who becomes the Queen of Persia. The story of Esther. In chapter 1 to 2, Esther becomes the queen to Ahasuerus of Persia. She was personally chosen by the king. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him, probably because of her beauty and intelligence. Chapter 3 to 4, Mordecai, Esther's guardian, refused to bow down and pay homage to Haman, a high official of the king. Haman becomes infuriated and plots to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom because of his pride. Mordecai hears of the plot and reports it to Esther. For it remains silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews for another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you are not attained royalty for such a time as this. From chapter 5 to 10, Esther outwits Haman and takes her petition to the king and priest for the protection of her Jewish people for Haman's wicked stratagem. The king, out of anger, has Haman hung on the gallows which he had built to destroy all the Jews. Esther's faith and courage saves her people. So we'll be answering the question, how do the female characters conforming to traditional views on women, or how do you find the female characters challenging these traditional views? How the characters in the Book of Esther conform to traditional views on women in several ways. First, the main female character, Esther, is portrayed as a passive and submissive woman who follows the instructions of her cousins Mordecai and ultimately becomes the queen of Persia by being chosen as the new king's bride. She does not actively seek power or influence, but rather is placed in a position of power through the actions of the male characters in the story. Additionally, Esther is portrayed as a virtuous and modest woman who is dedicated to her people and willing to risk her life to save them. This traditional view of women as virtuous models and self-sacrificing is recurrent in the Bible and other religious texts. Another female character in the story, Vashti, the previous queen, is portrayed as a disobedient and rebellious woman who is disposed by the king for refusing to obey his command to appear at the royal banquet. Her removal from the palace is often seen as a warning to other women to obey their husbands and conform to traditional gender roles, rather than an example of rebellion or assertiveness. Structuralism is an approach which assumes that literary works have underlying universal structures. This answers the questions of what patterns, motifs, or themes in this literary text are also found in other literary texts. What binary oppositions are repeated in the text? Good versus evil, old versus young, and light versus darkness. Are there patterns and elements within the text similar with other texts from other cultures? What do these similarities tell us about the common human experience? Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy are the books mostly found, or we can relate, for structuralism. Structuralism, it's possible to interpret many books in the Bible through a structuralist lens. A structuralism is a method of analyzing cultural and societal systems and their underlying patterns and structures. Some examples of books in the Bible that may be particularly relevant to structuralist analysis include the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which contains detailed laws and regulations for the organization and functioning of ancient Israelite society. The Gospel of Matthew, which represents a structured narrative of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. The Book of Genesis, which describes the creation of the book and humanity. The Book of Revelation, which describes the end of the world and the return of Jesus. And the Book of Job can also be related to structuralism. One example of a story in the Bible that could be related to structuralism is the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. In this story, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers and ultimately becomes a powerful official in Egypt. Through his various experiences and interactions with other characters, the story explores themes of jealousy, betrayal, forgiveness, and God's providence. By analyzing the story's structure and the way the different characters and events relate to each other, a structuralist might argue that the story is not just about the individual characters and their actions, but also about the larger societal and cultural system that shape their lives and experience. Here we can watch the story of Joseph, a story from prisoner to prince.
God's story, Joseph. So part of God's story is about a guy named Joseph, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Joseph who had 10 older brothers and one younger one. When Joe was a boy, he was his dad's favorite. In fact, his dad liked him so much better than his brothers that he gave Joe a special gift to prove it. You can imagine this made his brothers jealous. And Joe only made things worse. He told his brothers about dreams he had where he was ruling over them. Well, this made Joe's brothers furious. One day they were working and saw Joe coming. They said, "Here comes that dreamer." They threw Joe into a dark pit. They might have left him there forever, but they met some men traveling from Egypt and sold Joe to them as a servant instead. They thought that was slightly nicer than leaving him in a pit. Then they went home and told their father Joe had been killed by a wild animal. This broke their dad's heart. Kids, these brothers were really bad news. Selling a sibling is never a good idea. Ever. But the Bible says the Lord was with Joe. When Joe was a servant, he worked for a really important rich guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar liked Joe so much, he put him in charge of the whole house. Joe was happy until one day he was blamed for something he didn't do. Potiphar sent him straight to jail. Well, God was still with Joe, even in prison. The guard decided he liked Joe so much, he put him in charge of all the other prisoners. Then God gave Joe special knowledge about dreams. When two prisoners had dreams, Joe knew what they meant, so he told them. 2 years later, Egypt's ruler called Pharaoh had a dream, and nobody knew what it meant. But by now, one of the two prisoners Joe had helped was out of jail and working for Pharaoh. He told Pharaoh about Joe, and God helped Joe figure out what Pharaoh's dream meant. But Pharaoh's dream was really more of a nightmare. It meant that everybody in Egypt would have food for 7 years, then be hungry for 7 years. Joe told Pharaoh the only way to survive was to store food during the 7 good years. Well, Pharaoh thought Joe's idea was brilliant. He put him in charge. During the 7 hungry years, nobody could eat without getting food from Joe. He was like a human vending machine. Well, remember how Joe had 11 brothers? Like everybody else, they had to get food from Joe. And when they came, they didn't even recognize their brother. But Joe knew who they were. He secretly tested them to see if they changed. After all, they did throw him in a pit and sell him. Finally, he couldn't hide who he was from his brothers anymore. He told everyone to leave the room because he was about to cry. After sobbing for a few minutes, he told them, "I'm your brother Joseph. I'm the one you sold." The brothers couldn't believe it. They had hurt Joe, but God had taken care of him during the good times and the bad. Even with everything they had done to Joe, he forgave them because he was willing to follow God, even when it was hard. Joe told them, "You planned to harm me, but God planned it for good." And God used Joe to save many lives, including the family that was part of God's special rescue plan. And that's the story of Joseph. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Joe was his dad's favorite. His brothers sold him. Potiphar put Joe in charge. Joe was sent to jail. The guard put Joe in charge. Pharaoh had a bad dream. Joe told him what it meant. Pharaoh put Joe in charge. Joe's brothers had to come to him for food. Joe forgave them. This was part of God's rescue plan. And that's part of God's story.
Structuralism is an approach which assumes that literary works have underlying universal structures. For this, we will answer the question, are there patterns and elements within the text similar with other texts from other cultures? What do these similarities tell us about the common human experience? The similarities between the story of Joseph in the Bible and other texts from other cultures can tell us a lot about the common human experience. For example, the story of Joseph is filled with themes of betrayal, family division, and hardship, which are common themes across many cultures. It also speaks of God's sovereignty and faithfulness in the face of human suffering, which is a message that is applicable to all people, regardless of culture. The story of Joseph also speaks to the power of forgiveness, mercy, and grace, which are essential elements of the human experience. Through this story, we can find hope and strength in the midst of our own difficulties. One of the literary approaches is reader response. Reader response is the approach that makes the reader as the creator of meaning. It is not the text nor the author. The reader's purpose, concerns, needs, and experience influence how the literary work is read and how meaning is created. Are there many quotations, characters, or other elements in the work that have powerful impressions and impact on me? What do they leave such memorable effect on me? How can I connect this text to myself and to the world I live in? For this, we will be using the story of Joseph as our literary reader response. You can connect to the story of Joseph through the themes of forgiveness, perseverance, and the power of dreams. Joseph was able to forgive his brothers for their wrongdoings, persevere through difficult situations, and use his dreams to become a successful leader. These lessons of resilience and faith in the face of hardship can be applied in your own life and in the world today. And understanding Joseph's story can help provide perspective on your own experiences and how you can use them to make a positive impact. Reflection. Literary approach requires you to analyze the text, identify the main idea and purpose, and assess the author's use of language and techniques. You should also consider the text in relation to your own experiences and knowledge and evaluate the text implications for your understanding. It is also important to make connections between the text and other literature and theories, as well as to discuss the text's importance in the context of the broader literary principle. Lastly, you should reflect on the implications of the text for your own life and writing. How to choose the correct literary approach. Friendly reminder, it's also important to remember that literary criticism is an ongoing conversation and there is no one right or wrong interpretation of a text. And here's my references. Thank you.